Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachael Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started. Well, good people, I hope this finds you well loved today as you lean in with us as we lean into a conversation on the art and challenge of discourse, especially in this increasingly traumatized, fragmented, and polarized world that we're all trying to navigate. I'm very honored today to be joined by Dr. J. Derek McNeil, our beloved president and provost of the Seattle School, and one of my favorite people to actually engage in discourse with. Welcome, Derek.
Thank you. It really is a pleasure. This was not hard to say yes to when I heard it with you. So that makes us partners in that. I have always enjoyed my conversations and tussles and growth with you. Has been.
Yeah. And that's more what we're going to talk about, right? That we think of discourse as like, oh, let's have a conversation and it'll feel good and it'll be nice. And that's part of what I love. You know, Derek, I experience you as being someone incredibly faithful to staying in the tough conversations, but the necessary conversations that shape who we're called to be and how we're meant to live and love. And in part, why we're having this conversation today is because coming up at the end of the month, the Seattle School is actually hosting an inaugural event that is going to be a virtual summit designed to engage, like actually show what does it look like to have some challenging conversations. It's called Seattle School Connect. And the first theme of the inaugural Seattle School Connect is discourse. And want to just, give you as listeners a little taste of what it is. And I can talk more about it at the end. But, it's going to be focusing on really important cultural topics, the things that we all want to be in conversation about, but probably have a hard time finding reliable and kind of grounded conversation partners. But we have a lineup of 6 conversations that are going to kick off the last week of September. They'll have like a pre-recording that you have access to kind of get your brain thinking, and then a live conversation on Fridays at 5. These conversations kind of will hopefully have humility and hospitality and courage.
We'll aim in that direction.
Yeah, right. And they're going to be hosted by different parts of the Seattle School. So the Allender Center, the Center for Transforming Engagement, our graduate school, the Other Journal, as well as some incredibly special guests that I'm really looking forward to hearing from, Lisa Sharon Harper and Shane Claiborne. You'll have opportunity to hear more from Derek and many, many folks, including Dan and myself. If this is something, you're thinking, oh, yeah, I'm interested, you can check it out at the seattleschool.edu. If you just click on the events link, you can find more information about it. But things will be kicking off the week of September 22nd and running for 6 weeks. So I greatly encourage you to check it out. And this is in some ways core to who we are as an organization. So it's an attempt to invite people in, but something that we put a lot of thought and practice into. So, I think my first question, Derek, for you would be, in some ways, like, how is discourse different from, just an everyday conversation? Is it different? Yeah. Is it the same thing? Like, what are we talking about?
Right. It's interesting. I would say discourse moves us really towards maybe dialogue as opposed to discussion. Let's kind of make that distinction. Discussion's kind of, hey, we'll talk about a topic and we can either change each other or not change each other. I'll simply say, here's my ideas of it, and you can express your ideas. But discourse under dialogue is more of a change conversation, a conversation that will impact us. And that is something to go through as opposed to simply to just touch on. And inevitably, a certain type of discourse that leads to dialogue, it gives potential for transformation. When I have a discussion with somebody, I'm probably not assuming I'm going to be changed dramatically. It's just, we talk about whatever topic. But when I start getting into a discourse that moves to dialogue, the hope is that it changes us,
Mm.
that impacts us in a different sort of way, which requires more of my body to manage when you have ideas different than mine, and or we have a different perspective, or we're managing our distortions, which often
Mm.
happens when we get into discourse and dialogue. You realize, hey, you don't think the way I think. You don't see the world the way I see the world. And how do we reconcile that?
Yeah.
That's not usually what happens in a discussion of something. You can usually
Right.
talk about your ideas, but you're not really getting into each other or going through. So I would say a discourse, and I'll say discourse under dialogue, is much more about change and engagement and a deeper sort of learning and a deeper sort of commitment to belonging to each other.
Mm. I love how you talk about that sense of belonging and transformation. And I'm just struck by, especially for our listeners, because we talk so much about the impact of trauma on the body. You're naming that it's very bodily. And
Yes.
my experience of my own body in attempting to engage in discourse is that I get really activated.
Yes.
Um, and some of that is cultural for me. I come from a big Italian family where, discourse can get really passionate and loud and like engaging and, using lots of gestures. And I think about being at the dinner table, and there could be multiple moments of, I think, both discussion,
Yes.
but also like a kind of tussle and wrestling
Yes.
around
Yes.
ideas. But I also can get activated in a way that I know I'm not staying in like the best part, most wise, most courageous, most curious parts of myself. And I'm wondering if you could put a few more words to like what is happening in our bodies, maybe even like in the kind of this moment, this cultural moment we find ourselves in.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, this is a tough cultural moment to have deeper conversation. It seems easier for us to split and have kind of exclusive conversation, or
yeah.
us and them. I think kind of what you're speaking to is one, certainly our amygdala's firing related to threat. So if someone says something, it's like against my group. It's not even like against me, but against my group, I'll
Right.
get upset.
Right. Yeah.
And we find ourselves grouping in certain ways that actually we're kind of confirming our biases with each other,
Mm.
and we move further into us and them. So, but it's in fairness to us, I think we have to kind of highlight the fact that, hey, we're living in a cultural climate that has a lot of threat to it,
Yeah.
not just simply the political sort of context, but there's a certain level of economic threat. There's a
Yeah.
certain level of climate threat, whether you think it's man-made or just whatever. We're looking at weather patterns. It's like, okay, this is different.
Yeah.
There's a certain demographic shifts and changes. There is high levels of some degree of addiction going on, or what we call deaths of despair. All those are background things for many of us, and sometimes they're not background. They're very much present, that make it hard for us to not feel threatened all the time about something. And I think when your body's already heightened to threat, when there's already sort of technology, even though we think of it as a good thing,
Oof.
we're talking about AI, and
Yeah.
we're talking about the apocalyptic quality potentially of AI. So all these things create the environment for a polarization that is ripe. And then we have to talk about our own bodies. And I love kind of, talking about, hey, what it means to be Italian, if you will, culturally. But you also had rules that said, hey, how we resolve.
Yeah.
But not everybody knows when you come with a certain energy, not everybody
No.
knows how to take that energy in,
No.
because they didn't manage their bodies that way in their
Right.
families.
Right.
So they right away go to, wait a minute, you're attacking me. And you say, no, we're
Right.
just having a lively conversation. So how do we work with both our bodies in the context that we're in? Always a little bit
Yeah.
of threat and background, for some in the foreground, and some very present. And then how do we work with, in fact, we have representations of what it means to be us and express ourselves that aren't everyone else's.
Mhm.
So that means discourse is to try to help us find some common meanings.
Okay.
So when I see you, the fact that you said, hey, this is my background, this is my cultural space, it says, okay, I don't have to get alarmed because she's telling me. I just do this, and this is how I actually get connected with you.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's some groundwork we have to engage in. I think there has to be safe enough context. How do we intentionally create safe enough context? And we're increasingly running out of safe enough context.
Yeah.
I'd hope the church could be that, but the church may have never been a safe enough context. Family, you hope, but also that institution struggling. And so all of our institutions, there's not many that really hold safe enough conversations. So one of the reasons we're hoping in the kind of academy-like, but not, we're kind of applied learning, is to say, can we hold safe enough conversations? Can we be the people who actually facilitate these conversations? So we actually can find meaning with each other. So we can actually begin having a go-through conversation, a dialogue. So I think it's critically important and particularly hard. And when we lose our institutions that feel safe enough to have these conversations, we're really left to our groups that we cohere to in a very tribal sort of way. And we often don't have safe enough spaces where we define kind of the rules of engagement with each other, who are the enemy, if you will. And once we get locked into us and them thinking, there's so much research that says, hey, if I see you as a me and part of us, I will think differently about you versus if I see you as a part of them or an outsider. And our outsider does not, view of the outsider does not give grace.
No.
We see their motivations as more negative. We see their, what they're doing is more a part of their group, a part of who they are. So when we get into what stereotypical thinking, we might call it that, us and them thinking, we're really in trouble. And culturally right now, I think because the political dialogue has been so loud in the country, particularly with Christians, we're in a very much us and them conversation.
Yes.
And it becomes very hard to say hello without a certain threat response, which means we're not going to have discourse or onto dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, even you saying that, I think, it's like even in your family, like maybe where you could have conversations about so many things, like Italian culture can be kind of brutal because you can be like so mean to each other, but then, the family, you're going to work it out and come back around the table. And even if there's conflict, it's like, well, you're still going to show up for grandma's birthday. Like nobody's going to not show up. But I think things are so intense right now and so polarized that us versus them is playing out in family systems. Like, people you normally could talk about anything with, all of a sudden there's so many things that are just off limits. And you mentioned this, and it's something I've been paying attention to for myself, like the ways in which what is in the air, in the water, we're swimming in it, is being amplified by the ways we're engaging in social media, which already has a distinctly dehumanizing kind of infrastructure to it. And you can jump in your echo chamber. Like I was paying attention the other day. I mean, part of this, I think, is the ways that Elon Musk has really destroyed Twitter, but I was a faithful Twitter user, and I actually found it could certainly have its places that, got echo chambery or, whatever, but it was a place that I got a pulse on what's going on in the world, and not just, my tribe, but like multiple tribes. But with the changes, all of a sudden I started getting massive suggestions because they changed it. Like the loading page now is like you get suggestions, and all of the suggestions were like connected to what I believe and how I perceive the world, but like kind of taking it to the extreme. So like all of a sudden the only stories I'm getting, the only, language I'm hearing is totally like, playing to my fears, playing to exactly what you're talking about in that us versus them split. And we know in trauma and the impact of trauma, splitting is a kind of, like a knee-jerk instinct in order to kind of we do it within ourselves. I'm going to split off the exiled parts of me that I don't like, that are messy, that, feel like they betray me. And I'm going to kind of be two different people that, but that catches up to us. But when you see that kind of fragmentation happening on such a cultural level, I just am confessing it's really hard for me in
Yes,
this
it is
season. Like
hard.
I'm
No,
constantly like,
it is
that
hard,
person's
period.
dead to me and that group is dead to me. And
Yeah,
I have
yeah,
to be like,
yeah,
whoa, 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 whoa,
yeah,
whoa, whoa.
yeah.
What's
No, it
happening
is,
here?
I would say in fairness, it is hard. And there are moments when societies don't recover.
Yeah.
And so, in all honesty, we shouldn't treat this like we're living in a TV show. At the end of the show, it'll come back to normal. We are in a certain declining sort of clutch.
Yeah.
And if it erodes and continues to erode our institutions from family to church or religious institutions to educational institutions, it will mean in some serious decline of this culture. Um,
Mm,
and so it is a much more dangerous thing than a personal thing, because we're part of the culture is we individualize so much, and we say, well, you need to be Christ-like, you need to be more like Christ. And we actually even deny in the text where, there are conflicts in the text.
that's right.
We don't, tend to engage the Paul Barnabas breakup or the
Yeah.
Peter Paul scenario of who's
Yeah.
Jewish enough. And these are ethnic strife things that we're part of. And they had to have councils, the Council of Jerusalem, talk about, hey, how do we work through? Do people who are Gentiles need to be circumcised or not
That's right.
circumcised? And are they being? So these tensions are not new. They're human. And I think we have to give ourselves some credit um, as humans, not fully like Christ, hopefully pursuing Christ,
Yeah.
that we will have strife. And if we have our own sort of internal trauma, and then corporate trauma,
Mm-hmm.
that's a double whammy that really is hard to overcome.
That's right.
And how do we create safe enough spaces? And I'm calling safe enough spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And they need to be facilitated. There need to be boundaried spaces where we say, some people might call them sacred spaces.
Mm-hmm.
But these are spaces where I can begin to share who I am and trust that you won't try to destroy me.
Mm.
And you can begin to share who you are, and I actually listen deeply.
Mm.
And so it will take these opportunities to really listen deeply. There's a fair amount of research that suggests that people who feel powerless or feel oppressed in society really need to be listened to or need to feel like they're heard. And so there's a real power to being heard or to listening deeply. And that's our work a bit. And in terms of communities of faith or communities of trust, communities of safety. But the task is really quite complicated. And you mentioned media, and I think the early fantasy with media was the media would create these sort of safe enough spaces,
Right.
and we could talk
Right.
to people across the world, and we would share different ideas. Well, again, the sort of technology of algorithms and kind of recognizing that we're more prone to like the things we like that with people who are similar to us. It makes sense if you're going to at some point sell me something to get with people that we probably
Yeah.
all buy the same product. But some of that has led to us not really hearing or having spaces. Like I won't
Mm-hmm.
listen to some TV news channels if infuriate me, or vice
Yeah.
versa.
Right.
And we haven't cultivated spaces to say, hey, you're a person too, and I disagree with that perspective. It was very helpful right in the middle of the pandemic. I got involved with a men's group,
Mm-hmm.
and we were trying to have conversations about race. It was half white, half black men, and there's one Asian American brother who actually recruited me for the group. And we would meet every other week, every other Friday. Actually, I have a meeting with them this week, and
Mm-hmm.
we would try to have conversations about what it means to be. And I appreciate it got us beyond the sort of media conversation. And it got us into talking about our fears and got us into talking about, hey, will we ever be able to solve these things? And some part of your body says yes, and some part of your body says no, we may never.
Yeah.
But the conversations themselves have met my sense of belonging to this group of people in a way that surprised me. And so, as you mentioned, family, it's like, hey, we can tussle with each other, but at the end of the day, I'm going to have to see you in a couple of months at the very least. I think that sort of orientation towards belonging, it's not just a feeling of belonging, but I think we have to take on a sort of orientation to belong. That,
Mm-hmm.
Rachel, I belong to Rachel, and Rachel belongs to me. Now we're going to fight next week, maybe, but you still belong to me and I belong to you. I think people of faith are going to have to take on that sort of orientation with each other. And I think it begins with a decision to be something connected and linked to move us out of the us and them, out group, in group, for us to have some possibility of working through tough conversations. But when we move people out of our insider group into another group, we're going to have a hard time ever having a resolving conversation or transformative one.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because I think a lot and talk a lot about like the impact of spiritual abuse, which is very similar to multiple types of abuse. But like one of the elements of spiritual abuse that can be so destructive is the use of the split, the us versus them split, the
Yes.
insider outsider, to kind of hold on to some sense of control or create really rigid boundaries over who belongs and who doesn't. And as you mentioned, like that is not new. That's not a new instinct. That's a very ancient, very human origin kind of instinct to be able to define who's in and who's out. And then how do we kind of project all of our rage and our shame and our fears on the outsiders, so that we don't have to be afraid. Like we don't have to bear punishment. We don't have to deal with hard things. And so sadly, I kind of agree with you. It would be my hope that the church is meant to be a place, especially a spirit-filled people. And in some ways, that's what was so problematic about the early Christians, is that they were kind of pressing against these social class boundaries, these kind of rigid boundaries. And they were living as such a way that they belonged to each other and that even their enemies belonged to them. And again, not without very human sized realities. But I just think, man, I don't know where I was going with that other than
well,
just
it sparks a couple things. Yeah, for me, I can think of the early church notion of, hey, and they had all things in common. I don't think that was just about financial things in common. I think it was a sense of, hey, you are knitted together with each other. And the necessity of you knitted together then will give you some capacity of resilience, if you will, to work through what you're going to have to face. And so it's our togetherness that gives us resilience as opposed to our own individual toughness. But our individual sort of sensitivity and openness and toughness allows us to stay in the community. I mean, these are kind of individual and communal pieces. And I think the challenge of what it means to belong is much grittier, much more difficult, as opposed to the warm, fuzzy feeling like, I love you, and so this feels good. And well, some of it is, I can't stand you right now, but I am still connected to you. And how do we work with that and find ways not to injure each other in those little intimate tussles? Or how do we make a meaning that says, hey, I'm not trying to kill you, but I don't know if you really accept my life or accept the life that I, perceive will be taken out of me if I accept your perspective. How do we struggle with that? And I think this means we got to be in a relationship longer than just a hot minute as well. And so there's a story and narrative piece of it. How do I make meaning? And what's the story of you? And do I think you're trying to hurt me or not? Which is another sort of dilemma. We make myths of each other based on our own woundedness, based on our own trauma. We create stories around what's not safe. And then if we cue up somebody else in their story in terms of what we could spend a lot of time back and forth being unsafe with each other, queuing each other up, not knowing we're queuing each other up in a certain type of way. And that takes a certain amount of, again, toughness to say, let me stop this. But it will also require externally safe enough environments to do so and some facilitation.
So I've heard you say like facilitation is a part of creating a safe enough environment. I wonder what other things you would say. Here's some kind of qualities of a community or an environment that would warrant it being like, if people are going, I long to find these spaces, whether they're going to try to co-create it or looking for a place they can join, what are those things you say? This to me is attempting to get to a safe enough environment. And then I want to also hear from you, kind of like, you've named a few things, but like, what are some of the skills and capacities we need as we
Mm.
participate in those
Mhm.
environments? But first, I want to hear how you would define a safe enough environment.
Well, I'll say that skills and I'll come back to it. Skills and capacities are ongoing. I think it's a learning. It's a posture of I'm going to get hurt in this process, but I'm going to stick with it. There is a certain persistence and a stubborn persistence. I think in terms of the safe enough as a language I'll use, because I don't think anything is ultimately safe. Or someone, a First Nation person, say, "How about sacred enough?" And I think, yeah, it is sacred. It's an
Ooh,
issue of sacredness,
yeah, I like that.
and sacred in the sense of where heaven and earth can come near, where there's some possibility of transformation. It's a dedicated space. So I need some dedicated space. It can
Mhm.
certainly happen in a conversation with someone, but even that, it's like, could we take some time? Could we just take
Yeah.
a couple of hours to kind of, so that you actually carve out some space and some time to do this? So I think boundary time is the first thing. I think the sort of willingness to listen deeply, and listen not just simply to the content, but listen to each other's fears.
Mm.
I think we have to get past some of the content, because often we'll say, "Here's what I think is," and underneath it, the question is, well, what frightens you? Because you're coming at me like something and I don't know if I'm gonna attack you or not, but you're coming at me like I am, which makes me want to put up my guard.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is, what frightens you? What's frightening to you? What do you hope for? And what's frightening to you? And then I think there's certain curiosity, that a curiosity that's able to overcome anxiety. And again, it's a shifting of the brain, part of the brain that's engaging. It's not the amygdala firing, "Oh my God, it's unsafe," but it's the prefrontal cortex saying, "Okay, but what about that? Is that really a snake? Is that really a
That's right.
person sitting in the chair in the dark in my room, or is it my coat?"
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
employing the brain in a different sort of way. And again, without a certain type of safety, the brain can't get there.
Mm-hmm.
So that's probably the strongest things I would say: a boundary, safe enough, sacred space, clear sense of sometimes intentionality in that space. And I think the capacity to be curious and listen deeply. I mean, those are just beginning places. And then I think there's a whole host of things you've got to manage. You've got to manage each other's own distortions.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, what's it mean for me as an African American male to be with a group of, half white men, half black men? Where do I think the threat's coming from? I have a whole history of what I think is going to happen in that space. Someone's going to say something stupid. I have all that mapped out before it ever happens. How do I examine my own mapping?
Mm-hmm.
My own assumptions of what's going to happen, or how I'm supposed to act, and my sense of betrayal, which gets into group dynamics a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
We worry about our level of betrayal of our home group, our in group, and will they perceive us as betraying them,
Yeah.
and hence us be put out. Because as social animals, we need groups.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to betray my home group to be engaged with a group that's not. This is always the challenge of when we go do peacemaking
Yeah.
and two people from different groups talk, and the fear of the groups that they left behind to do this conversation is like, "Are you going to betray us when you go?"
Mm-hmm.
And how do we actually not betray our home group, at least manage the fears of that, even as we work through issues of betrayal, historical as well as current? So
Mm-hmm.
those are just some of the qualities I think. There's a prayerfulness. There's a lot of stuff that says mindfulness and prayerfulness are very helpful to soothe our bodies. And I think we're also hoping we find resonance in groups of people,
Mm-hmm.
because we can't do this on our own. I can't
Yeah.
resolve my conflict with you singularly. I need
Right.
you. And sometimes I need the group around us to say,
Yeah.
come on, Rachel and Derek, you need to talk to each other.
Yeah.
And how do we take responsibility for each other in that regard as a group member to say, "Hey, we need you guys to keep talking. It's not done yet," because you kind of went to your separate corners and you complained to your group of three on either side. It's not done. You need to have to keep talking to each other. And we need a commitment from a group that says, no, we belong to each other in such a way that we are also going to engage in this conflict with you and support the two of you or the three of you or the how many of you working it through. And all that's hard work. All that
Mm.
is hard work.
Well, I think that's the question I feel rising up in me, and part of why, in some ways, I'm just so deeply appreciative of you, um, because you are a person I think of when I feel like I'm done. I'm retiring from like discourse and caring and transformation and hope. Like,
Hmm.
like what's the point? Because I do feel it's a person, like both personally within our organization, in the larger culture, in my
Uh,
family. Like it's just been one of those seasons where it does feel like, what is the point? And it's hard work. And then you do this hard work, and then people still split, and you're like, guys, we're staying in it. And so then I just think I would love, if you feel so inclined, to hear from you, because I think it also requires hope. And I guess
yeah,
I'm curious, like,
yeah.
how do you stay, like, what gives you hope in staying in these waters with all that you've seen and tasted and known in your life with regard to all the things we're talking about, and then
Hmm.
what you're seeing in this particular moment? What keeps you at the table?
That's a good question. There's some part of me that I probably still don't fully understand. And I'll say it that way, and then I'll talk about the parts I understand. That part of me is almost like a little kid who keeps believing, we're going to do this. We're going to do this. And I think I have a deep hunger, and it's probably an intimacy piece, for people to be linked that I know in their linking would be a good thing. And so I can look at us and say, oh, daggone, that would be a great thing if these relationships worked in a certain way. And I do get stubborn about it. Now, I also get disappointed in that part.
Sure. Yeah.
But the other piece is a sort of trust in the infinite and finite spaces. So when you say hope, I don't necessarily trust what's in front of me all the time to say it's going to be this crappy always. But I have this sense that it can get better, and I trust it will get better even though I don't see it right now. And I'm not sure where all that comes from. Some degree,
Yeah.
I'm sure, the way my parents raised me, some degree of what it means to walk with Christ for me personally. But I have the ability to look beyond the moment and have hopes for a future. That's really what it is. And it's not at all that I'm not discouraged at times.
Sure.
I will say to myself at times, but if not, I know my God is able, but if not, I'm a little Hebrew boy. Um, we'll step into the fiery furnace, but God is able to save us, but if not. And I certainly give space for the but if not, which means I will be disappointed. It's not a journey of non-disappointment or avoidance of disappointment, but it typically doesn't fully quench my hunger to see us connected and linked. I think there's such potency when people get together, the energy that's created when people get together and can find some common purpose together and work together. There's just a whole different energy. And that energy has the possibility of transformation, which I think is what God says, hey, I and the Father are one. And I want you, in fact, to also be one. That energy, that vitality, that possibility, for whatever reason, I still believe it can happen. And so I'm able to manage my body enough in the moment, which is the big part of it. It's like, you get flooding and say, okay, calm down, breathe,
Yeah.
breathe, 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 breathe deeply. And say, okay, I'm not going to punch you. 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 Okay, there's still some possibility here. And I, even in those moments, I find myself looking for the possibility. And I would say it that way because in some ways it's not even like I'm always intentional. But I can hear in the hurt why I don't want to do it anymore. And I feel my own weepiness when I say that.
Mm-hmm.
But I can hear, sometimes we'll have a conversation, I can hear in the hurt, well, I'm done. You're dead to me. I'm like, no, it's because I want so much in this relationship and you can't give it to me.
Yeah.
And I can hear that part. And so it feels like, well, no, you're not dead. It's not dead to you. It's just hurtful to you. So I can hear that part, and it makes me still want to not let go,
Yeah.
to hold on, to stay in the tussle, because I think there's something about Jacob tussling in the desert
Yeah.
of not letting go And I don't even think, in that story of Jacob becoming Israel, it's not even to me a story of somebody becomes new as much as their sense of purpose in the world is altered.
Yeah, say more
So the
about that.
newness comes from Jacob. I'm going to give you a different purpose. Now, you've been trying to strive for yourself. It's all been about you and how you get ahead and how you don't get behind. And well, let me change your purpose. And again, he has to be reminded 2 chapters later that, hey, let me tell you what I did with you. I wounded you to give you a different purpose. And so how do we, in some ways, hear God's new purpose for us? Not even new qualities of personality, with each other, that I'm supposed to do something on behalf of. So part of the other piece in this discourse conversation is how do we, through discourse, find our purpose in service? Find what we're called to do. And I think some of that requires us rubbing up against each other. Is for you to say, I'm done. And I say, no, I'm not going to let you go. And you keep tussling. I'm not going to let you go. Or you, which you are very tenacious, you don't let it go.
Yeah.
You hold on. That's the making of you in a different sort of way. And I believe that collectively about us, that we really deeply are built. We just culturally sometimes believe we're hyper individualistic in the sense of, hey, I'm going to be a self-made person. I am my. Well, the truth is we are social animals to our core.
Oh, yeah.
Our brain functions, our body functions, all in some ways are meant. The safest place for us is in community. And the question is, can we find safe enough communities? Not the opposite. Can I be individual, stand alone? It's can we find safe enough communities? And I think that's what the wounding is. When family is not safe enough, or when church is not safe enough, or when school is not safe enough, or when institutions are not safe enough, that's the deep wounding of us. That's personal, that's deeply personal. And it's a person that maybe have wounded us, but it's not just a person, it's a society that was not safe.
Yeah, I love the way you talked about, like, in some ways it's a young boy in you that,
Yeah.
like, just still believes, because I think in some ways, like, the part of me that's like, "You're dead to me," is it is a young,
Yeah.
very hope-filled,
Yes.
very tenacious, very gritty part of me that, man, I love so much. And I would say it's not at all like my innocence was shattered in, like,
Mm-hmm.
the past
Mm-hmm.
5 years just culturally for the
Mm-hmm.
first time, but I do think something of my naivete
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
privilege,
Yeah.
was exposed,
Hmm.
and you and we've had many conversations about this over many years, and so I think having to make space. I'm thinking about this, around, like, how do I stay in these places of discourse that I do think bring
Mm-hmm.
transformation,
Mm-hmm.
is also cultivating a capacity to grieve, to really let the disappointment. I think that's what you're saying, like, to make room for the disappointment that's real. Like, when you think people have more kind of, you've talked a lot about, resilience, and that's
Mm-hmm.
something you
Mm-hmm.
research and
Mm-hmm.
are actively kind of trying to bring even to the Seattle School, is a deeper kind of resilience. And you've named with me before in conversation that it requires a kind of sensitive toughness to really stay in it. And I feel like I want to cut off the sensitivity. Like, no, if I could just be less sensitive, I could be tough, And it's like, oh, but I need that sensitive part of
Yes.
me that actually does want to belong and wants to create context where others, like radical belonging, where
Yeah.
others belong. And
Yeah.
so I think the capacity to let my heart, instead of just being enraged, also just be really sad that, you know, you won't always get to keep all the pieces and parts together in this quest.
And even for me with you, and not just you, but appreciate the anger, what the anger is saying. And the anger is saying, I want to be close, but I can't be safe with you. And so I have to fight you. Or,
Yeah.
it's not flight, it's a fight with you because I really want to be close, but I can't trust the closeness won't hurt me.
Yeah.
And for us to be able to translate for each other, this is the sort of thing, what frightens you is an important question. We've got kind of like a 5-stage process to discourse that we're trying to develop a little bit of a technology because I think most of
Mm,
us don't have a good tool.
right.
And, so I say some of it is, some of the question is, what do you hope for? Or you can interchange this with, either first or second question, what are you frightened of? And those two questions are very important to go together because they speak to our desire. My fear speaks to my desire, and what I hope for speaks to my desire.
Mm.
And the concern that my desire will be crushed, I will be unseen, I will be unengaged. And so any process of which we're trying to get to a discourse place has to ask, what frightens you? I think then that try to move the brain into, and what are you still curious about, is a third type of question. We did a project with the board a couple of years ago. We asked them, we were putting something tough in front of them, and we said, hey, let's try to go through a process. We spent like about 4 meetings on what frightens you. And so you can't think of it as, oh, well, I'll just tell you in 5 minutes and we'll move on, because there's just layers of what frightens you.
Yeah.
And you just kind of like, I realize that frightens me too. And we live in such a defended space that we not even fully sure what all the sensitivity part is saying what frightens you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then the curiosity is, hey, what do I still need to know to kind of push it to a prefrontal cortex to begin processing and doing less distortion. Then we ask the question of what do we hear God saying to us? So it brings in a transcendent quality of, you could say, what are the themes we're hearing? But what are we hearing God saying to us? We've been tussling with each other, and maybe we haven't come to an agreement, but what are we hearing God saying to us? Not that means there's going to be a conclusion. Because I think sometimes we think, oh, God said it and that's it. Well, sometimes it's clearly like, I don't know what's being said. I don't know what you're saying to us, God, because in some ways it's a paradox that we have to sit with a paradoxical something or other, and there's no instant solution. And then finally, what are the things we have in common? And so we're trying to develop a process around that and kind of facilitate a process. Say, hey, this is a tough topic. Identity is a tough topic. So race is a tough topic. Gender is a tough topic. Economics is a tough topic. How do we actually kind of sit and walk through a process with each other? And the process is not to win or lose. Again, this is the in-group, out-group sort of thing. If I'm going into this to kind of win, we're sunk. So you have to kind of disavow people the notion of winning as opposed to expanding in a way. And understanding more deeply what God might be saying to us, which is more infinite a thing than a finite thing. Finite things, I win, you lose. We're still very geared to that, and that's cultural, and that's not a problem, that's human. But it can get in the way of hearing infinite things in finite moments. And so how do we work ourselves through that process? And we need each other, my goodness. When you don't want to, I need to be standing there saying, come on back. Okay, not today, maybe tomorrow. Come on back. And we need that for each other. I will need it.
Yeah.
We will need it for each other. And this is that sense of, again, belonging and linkage and connection that feels very important. So we heal together. I think certainly some healing is done alone and having to face into our stories alone, but we heal together as we wound often together.
I firmly believe this, that it's someday I plan on asking God more about it, because it's clearly a design. And I think there is something very paradoxical about it, because I think we're all, if we could find a way to heal, in isolation, we would, but that's not, you're absolutely right. That's not how we're made. And I think a lot about how we have such disordered imagination that we, like you said, so much distortion, that we actually have to imagine and create new imagination together. And I do need you, and I need others. And I need people who see the world very differently than I do to help me imagine more fully, like who we are and who we're meant to be. As we kind of bring things toward a close, I guess I'm curious, one, if there's just anything else you'd want our listeners to hear. But I also find myself curious, and maybe it's the group that you mentioned already, but just, can you recall, recent, however long that ago that needs to be, a recent experience of a discourse community that transformed you, or something that like changed you through your relationship and conversations with others?
Yeah, I have to. I'll go back to this group again. Again, we meet on Fridays, every other Friday, and we kind of have a running sort of. Everybody can't come all the time, but we kind of keep the date open. Well, the gentleman who actually took the initiative to begin this group, he has since passed. He died last year. He was an older gentleman.
Sorry to hear that.
But his impact in the group was pretty potent, and I won't go into who he was, but he was well heeled status wise. I mean, it was interesting. He'd been a CEO of a corporation, and so it was unusual for me to be with this group of men. It's like, okay, what am I going to deal with in terms of white guys and black guys, and but he said something one day that really was pretty potent for me, and we were having a conversation, and typically sometimes these conversations go, tell us about yourselves. It's usually white guys saying, tell us about yourselves, black guys. We want to help you. We want to be supportive. We want
to help you.
And we got into this conversation about fear again.
Mm-hmm.
And he and I were going back and forth a little bit. And he paused. And again, it was a pause. He paused in the group and said, hey, the truth is all of us white guys are frightened in some way. I was like, okay. I've never heard a person in power say anything like that. And it stopped us all because it changed the relationship in the space. Mm-hmm. It was no longer the patriarchy, white male, sort of something or other. It had to push us out of that dynamic. Mm. And I think after then, we started talking about how much we loved each other and and I don't think we were trying to be intentional as much as, I have affection for you. We've been in this, we've been tussling with each other. We've been struggling with truthful, honest things. And I care for you. And so I found myself saying to one of the guys, European American guy in that group, I said, if you see me on the street and I walk by, I'm with maybe two other black brothers, and I walk past you and don't salute you as another brother of mine, you should slap me in the face. You can hit me upside my head. Because in some ways I'm saying, hey, no, we belong. We have been in this long enough to actually give each other a level of truth that we belong to each other. And I can't deny that. Even in my group of loyalty, I can't deny that. And so I have not intentionally tried to change, but it has changed parts of me. And I came into that group saying, I'm not sure how long I'll be with you all because this is a nice little exercise, but I don't have time for this. And here I am 3 years later, still on Fridays, meeting with a group of men and having conversations. And sometimes it's just kind of, nonsense conversations. But often we'll touch on something that speaks deeply to us, and we'll find some commonality without erasing our differences.
That's right.
And so that's the challenge. How do we not erase our differences, but find our commonality? And so that's what I'll leave us today with.
Well, Derek, I want to say thank you so much. Hopefully, if you've had an opportunity to listen, you are understanding a little more deeply why Derek McNeil is one of my favorite people to be in conversation with. And I do hope that if you want to engage in a space where we are attempting to be a safe enough space to lean into some of these harder conversations, that you will check out the Seattle School Connect series. Again, you can go to theseattleschool.edu, click on the events tab. It should pop up. You can register. It's free. And you can tune in. Thanks again, Derek.
Thank you, Rachel. It's good to be with you.
The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.